In 1878, 3 brothers walked untouched through death itself, but when children began vanishing from Millfield Prairie, the government buried the truth so deep that even God seemed to forget. Tonight you'll learn why some secrets should stay buried. The autumn wind swept across Millfield Prairie with an urgency that made the wheat stalks bow like penitents in prayer. October 1878 had brought more than the usual harvest concerns to this isolated Nebraska settlement. It had brought the fever. Marcus Whitfield pressed his stethoscope against young Timothy Morrison's chest, the metal cold even through the boy's sweat-soaked nightshirt. The 8-year-old's breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps, his skin burning with a heat that seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper than flesh. Dark veins had begun to spread beneath his pale skin like twisted roots, and his eyes rolled back, showing only the whites. How many more? Doctor. Whitfield asked Martha Morrison, though he dreaded the answer. The woman looked as though she'd aged a decade in the past week, her auburn hair now streaked with premature gray, her hands trembling as she wrung a damp cloth. 7 families on Elm Street alone, Martha whispered, her voice hoarse from days of weeping. The Hendersons lost their baby girl yesterday morning, little Mary Peterson. She's barely breathing, and her mother says she speaks in tongues now, languages that sound older than creation itself. The doctor had seen epidemics before during his years in Chicago. Cholera, typhoid, influenza, that swept through tenements like wildfire. But nothing like this. The fever struck without warning, consuming its victims from within, yet leaving behind symptoms that defied medical explanation. Children were the most vulnerable, their small bodies unable to withstand the relentless heat that seemed to cook them alive. But it wasn't just the fever, it was what came with it. The hallucinations, the voices, the way some of the afflicted would suddenly speak in perfect Latin or ancient Greek, languages they'd never heard before. Dr. Whitfield had documented 17 cases of children reciting biblical passages in Aramaic, despite having never been taught to read English properly. A crash of thunder shook the small farmhouse, though the October sky had been clear moments before. Lightning illuminated the prairie in stark, unnatural colors, purples and greens that didn't belong in any earthly storm. The weather's been strange since the sickness came, Martha observed, glancing nervously at the window. My husband says the wheat's been growing wrong too. Taller than it should be this late in the season, and the kernels, they're black as coal. Outside Timothy's bedroom window, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed on the wooden porch. 3 distinct sets, moving in perfect unison, their boots striking the boards with mechanical precision. The Ashford brothers are here, Martha said, a mixture of relief and unease in her voice. They've been walking house to house since sunset, ministering to the afflicted. Dr. Whitfield had heard about Ezra, Josiah, and Micah Ashford, though he'd yet to meet them personally. The 3 had arrived in Millfield 6 months prior, claiming to be traveling ministers from Pennsylvania. They'd purchased a plot of land on the prairie's eastern edge and quickly constructed a small chapel, working with inhuman efficiency. Local carpenters swore the building had been completed in a single night, though that was surely an exaggeration born of rural folklore. What wasn't exaggeration was their apparent immunity to the fever that was decimating the community. While families buried their children and the doctor worked himself to exhaustion treating the afflicted, the Ashford brothers moved freely among the sick without showing the slightest symptom. The brothers entered without knocking, as had become their custom when visiting the sick. They moved with an eerie synchronization that made Dr. Whitfield's medical mind recoil, like 3 parts of a single organism rather than separate individuals. Their black coats rustled like crow's wings, and the temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that their breath became visible in small puffs of vapor. Ezra, the eldest, stood nearly 7 feet tall with pale skin that seemed to glow in the lamplight, as if lit from within. His face was angular and sharp, with high cheekbones that cast deep shadows across his gaunt features. Josiah and Micah flanked him, identical twins whose green eyes held an intensity that made Dr. Whitfield's skin crawl. They appeared to be in their 30s, though something about them suggested a much greater age. Perhaps it was the way they carried themselves, with the careful stillness of ancient statues. "We've come to pray over the child," Ezra announced, his voice carrying an odd harmonic quality, as if multiple people were speaking in perfect unison. The words seemed to echo longer than they should in the small room, bouncing off the walls with supernatural resonance. "Of course, Brother Ashford," Martha replied, stepping aside quickly. "We're so grateful for your ministry. Without you, we'd have lost half the town by now." Dr. Whitfield watched with growing unease as the three brothers surrounded Timothy's bed. Up close, he could see details that his rational mind struggled to process. Their skin had an oily, iridescent quality that shifted and changed in the flickering lamplight. When they moved, it was with fluid grace that seemed to defy human anatomy, joints bending at angles that shouldn't have been possible, movements that were too smooth, too coordinated. They joined hands around the boy's fevered form and began to chant in what initially sounded like Latin. But as Dr. Whitfield listened more carefully, he realized the language was far older, filled with consonants and vowel combinations that human throats weren't designed to produce. The words seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and into his bones. The temperature in the room continued to drop, forming ice crystals on the window glass despite the October warmth outside. Timothy's labored breathing began to ease, but something else was happening, something that made the doctor's medical training rebel against what he was witnessing. As the brothers prayed, their skin began to shimmer more intensely, taking on the appearance of oil on water. Their voices layered and harmonized in ways that human vocal cords shouldn't be able to produce, creating sounds that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The very air in the room became thick and oppressive, like breathing syrup, and their eyes reflected the lamplight like those of nocturnal predators, with an inner luminescence that pulsed in rhythm with their chanting. Dr. Whitfield noticed other disturbing details. The brothers cast no shadows on the wall despite the bright lamplight. The wooden crucifix above Timothy's bed began to smoke and char, filling the room with the acrid smell of burning pine. Most unsettling of all, Timothy himself began to change during the ritual. The dark veins beneath his skin started to pulse with the same rhythm as the brothers chanting. His fever-bright eyes took on a greenish tint that matched those of his supposed healers. For a brief moment, his voice joined the chanting in that impossible ancient language, though the boy had been unconscious moments before. "The fever is leaving him," Ezra announced after several minutes of this otherworldly performance. Indeed, Timothy's breathing had normalized, and his skin was cooling to a healthy temperature. The dark veins faded, though Dr. Whitfield thought he could still see faint traces of them if he looked carefully. Martha Morrison fell to her knees beside the bed. "Praise God, you've saved him. You've performed a miracle." Dr. Whitfield checked the boy's pulse with trembling fingers, strong and steady, completely normal by any medical standard. Timothy's eyes fluttered open, clear and bright for the first time in days, though that unsettling green tint remained. It was impossible by every medical standard the doctor knew, yet here was the evidence before him. But as Timothy sat up, speaking his first coherent words in a week, Dr. Whitfield noticed something that chilled him to the bone. The boy was speaking in perfect Latin, reciting what sounded like passages from some ancient text. "In tenebris habitamus, in luce moriamur, tres fratres, una anima, infinita potentia." Martha looked confused but delighted. "He's speaking the holy tongue. Surely this is a sign of God's favor." The Ashford brothers exchanged meaningful glances, their identical smiles revealing teeth that were too white, too sharp. "We must visit the other afflicted households," Josiah said, his voice carrying the same unsettling harmony as his brothers. "The night grows long, and there are many souls in need of our comfort." "Yes," Micah agreed, his words seeming to overlap with his twins in impossible ways. "The harvest approaches, and we must gather what has been sown." As the brothers prepared to leave, Dr. Whitfield noticed the full extent of the damage their presence had caused. The wooden cross above the bed was now completely blackened and cracked, as if exposed to extreme heat. The metal handle of his medical bag had turned ice cold, and the glass of water on the nightstand had developed a thin layer of frost. Most disturbing of all, Timothy continued to whisper in that ancient language, his eyes now glowing faintly in the darkened room. The Ashford brothers visited 8 more homes that night, their route taking them to every house where the fever had struck. In each case, the impossible ritual was repeated, and in each case, the fever broke within minutes of their arrival. By dawn, not a single person in Millfield Prairie remained visibly ill. The townspeople spoke of miracles, of divine intervention, They praised the brothers as agents of God's mercy, saviors who had delivered them from certain death. But Dr. Whitfield couldn't shake the memory of those shimmering inhuman eyes, or the way every religious symbol in the treated homes had turned to ash in the brothers' presence. He spent the remainder of the night documenting what he had witnessed, his normally steady handwriting shaking as he tried to put the impossible into words. As the sun rose over the prairie, casting long shadows across the wheat fields that now grew black and twisted, the doctor made a decision that would change everything. He would continue to monitor the healed patients no matter what he might discover. He had no way of knowing that within a week, the children would start disappearing, or that their voices would still be heard in the wheat fields, singing in languages that predated human civilization. 5 days after the miraculous healings, Dr. Marcus Whitfield found himself questioning not just his medical expertise, but his very sanity. The fever had indeed vanished from Millfield Prairie as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving behind a community transformed by equal measures of gratitude and religious fervor. Sunday services at the Ashford Brothers Chapel now drew crowds that spilled out into the surrounding wheat fields, where the grain continued to grow in defiance of the approaching winter. But the doctor's private medical journals told a different story, one that kept him awake at night, poring over observations that defied everything he understood about human physiology and divine intervention. Dr. Whitfield? Sarah Henderson stood in his office doorway, her usual composed demeanor cracked by barely contained anxiety. She was the town's schoolteacher, a sharp-minded woman of 30 whose husband had died in the fever's first wave. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, but several strands had escaped, giving her a wild, desperate appearance. "I need to speak with you about something unusual. Please sit." The doctor gestured to the chair across from his cluttered desk, pushing aside stacks of medical notes and sketches that would have seemed like the ravings of a madman to any colleague. "What's troubling you, Sarah? You look as though you haven't slept in days." She glanced around nervously before lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "It's about the children. The ones who were healed by the Ashford brothers. They're different now, changed in ways that go beyond simple recovery." Dr. Whitfield set down his pen and leaned forward intently. "Different how?" "I've been conducting my own observations, but I'd like to hear your perspective as someone who works with them daily." Sarah took a shuddering breath. "Timothy Morrison came to school yesterday. His mother was so grateful he'd recovered that she insisted he return to his studies immediately, despite my suggestions that he might need more time to regain his strength." She paused, choosing her words with the careful precision of someone who feared being dismissed as hysterical. "He knew things, Doctor. Things he'd never learned. Things no 8-year-old should know." "What sort of things, Doctor?" Whitfield asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. His own examinations of the recovered children had yielded similar disturbing results. He recited entire passages from advanced theological texts that we don't have in our schoolhouse. Complex mathematical equations that I barely understand myself, despite my education at the normal school in Lincoln. He drew diagrams of human anatomy with perfect accuracy, labeling organs and systems in Latin as if he'd studied medicine for years. Sarah's voice grew more strained with each revelation, and when I asked him where he'd learned these things, he looked at me with those eyes and said the voices in his dreams had taught him. Dr. Whitfield felt his throat constrict. "Voices? Did he describe them in any detail?" "He said they speak in the old tongue, the language from before words had names. He claimed they show him pictures of places that exist beneath the ground, vast chambers filled with symbols that hurt to look at directly." Sarah leaned forward, her knuckles white as she gripped the arms of her chair. "That's not all. Little Emma Peterson. She was barely able to speak coherently before the fever struck. Now she's conversing in what sounds like ancient Greek, and she's been drawing the most disturbing pictures." From her satchel, Sarah produced a collection of papers that made Dr. Whitfield's blood run cold. The drawings were executed with the skill of someone far beyond a 6-year-old's capabilities, showing intricate geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when looked at directly. But it was the subject matter that truly disturbed him. Underground chambers filled with robed figures, 3 tall shadows standing over smaller forms, and symbols that hurt his eyes to examine closely. "My God," he whispered, comparing the drawings to similar sketches in his own notes. "Where did she learn to draw like this?" That's what terrifies me, Sarah replied. Emma's mother brought her to the schoolhouse this morning, hoping I could explain what's happening. The child spent the entire morning drawing these pictures while humming in that strange, harmonic way that all the recovered children seem to have developed. It's beautiful and horrible at the same time. Dr. Whitfield knew exactly what she meant. During his examinations of the healed patients, he'd noticed that their voices had acquired an unusual quality, a subtle harmonic resonance that seemed to echo longer than natural speech. When multiple recovered children spoke together, their voices would synchronize in ways that created haunting melodies. There's something else, Sarah continued, her voice dropping to barely audible levels. The children have been gathering at night. Mrs. Morrison caught Timothy sneaking out of the house just after midnight, walking toward the Ashford Chapel with perfect certainty despite the darkness. When she followed him, she found all 12 of the recovered children standing in a circle in the wheat field, holding hands and singing in that ancient language. Did Mrs. Morrison hear what they were singing? Sarah nodded grimly. She said it was the same words the Ashford brothers used during their healing rituals. But the children knew every verse, every inflection, as if they'd been practicing for years. When she tried to approach them, they all turned to look at her simultaneously, their eyes reflecting the moonlight like animals. Dr. Whitfield's mind raced as he tried to process this information alongside his own disturbing observations. During his post-healing examinations, he documented several physiological changes in the recovered patients that defied medical explanation. Their body temperatures had stabilized at several degrees below normal, yet they showed no signs of illness. Their reflexes had become supernaturally quick, and their strength had increased dramatically. He'd watched 10-year-old James Peterson lift a 50-pound bag of grain with one hand. Most unsettling were the changes to their blood. When examined under his microscope, the recovered children's blood showed unusual cellular structures that resembled nothing in medical literature. The cells moved with purpose and intelligence, forming temporary patterns that looked almost like writing in an unknown script. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, no matter how strange it might sound, Dr. Whitfield said, pulling out a leather-bound journal filled with his most disturbing observations. Have you noticed any physical changes in the children beyond their enhanced knowledge and behavioral modifications? She hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. Their skin has that strange quality, like it's lit from within. And in certain light, you can see patterns beneath the surface like veins but arranged in geometric shapes. Emma's mother mentioned that her daughter's hair has been growing unusually fast, and it's changed color from blonde to this deep auburn shade that almost looks red in sunlight. The eyes, Dr. Whitfield added grimly, they all have that green tint now, haven't they? And they seem to glow faintly in low light. How did you know? Sarah asked, though the answer was written across the doctor's haggard features. Because I've been documenting every change, every anomaly since the night of the healings, he replied, opening his journal to pages covered with detailed anatomical sketches and notes written in increasingly desperate handwriting. Sarah, I don't think what happened to those children was healing in any conventional sense. I think something else entirely occurred, something that we're only beginning to understand. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of children's voices drifted through the office window. But these weren't the normal sounds of play or learning. They were the same harmonic melodies Sarah had described, sung in perfect unison by young voices that shouldn't have been capable of such complex musical arrangements. Dr. Whitfield and Sarah rushed to the window, peering out at the schoolyard where all 12 of the recovered children stood in a precise circle. Their eyes were closed, their faces turned toward the sky, and they swayed slightly as they sang in that ancient, impossible language. The late afternoon sun cast their shadows in perfect geometric patterns on the ground, but it was what stood at the edge of the wheat field that made both adults step back from the window in terror. 3 tall figures in black coats watched the children with obvious satisfaction. Even at a distance, the Ashford brothers' pale skin seemed to shimmer with that oil-on-water quality that Dr. Whitfield remembered from the healing night. As if sensing their observation, all 3 brothers turned their attention to the doctor's office window. Their eyes glowed with that same inner light, and their mouths curved in identical smiles that revealed teeth too sharp to be human. Then, without any apparent signal, the children stopped singing and began walking toward the wheat field where the brothers waited. They moved with the same uncanny synchronization, their small forms disappearing into the tall, blackened grain that rustled without any wind. "We have to do something," Sarah whispered, her face pale with horror. "Those aren't children anymore, are they? They're something else, something the brothers created." Dr. Whitfield closed his journal with shaking hands. "I fear you're right. But the question is, what exactly have the Ashford brothers done to them, and what do they plan to do next?" As darkness began to fall over Millfield Prairie, the doctor and the schoolteacher could hear the children's voices rising from the wheat field, their harmonic songs growing stronger and more complex. The sound seemed to resonate through the ground itself, as if the very earth was responding to their call. Neither of them could have imagined that by morning, half of those voices would be silenced forever, not by death, but by something far worse. The morning of October 15, 1878, dawned with an unnatural stillness that made even the prairie dogs retreat to their burrows. Dr. Marcus Whitfield had spent the night at his office window, watching the wheat field where the children's voices continued their ethereal chorus until just before sunrise. Now, as pale light crept across Millfield, an oppressive silence had fallen over the town like a burial shroud. It was Martha Morrison's screams that shattered the quiet. Dr. Whitfield grabbed his medical bag and ran toward the Morrison farmhouse, his boots splashing through puddles that had formed overnight despite the clear skies. Other townspeople emerged from their homes, drawn by the soul-wrenching sound of a mother's anguish. He found Martha collapsed on her front porch, her nightgown torn and muddy, her hands bloodied from clawing at the wooden steps. Her husband, Thomas, knelt beside her, his face ashen with shock. "Timothy," Martha sobbed, the word barely intelligible through her hysteria. "He's gone. My boy is gone." "When did you last see him?" Dr. Whitfield asked, kneeling beside the distraught woman while checking her pulse. Her heart was racing dangerously fast. "I checked on him at midnight," Thomas answered, his voice hollow. "He was sleeping peacefully in his bed, but this morning—" He gestured helplessly toward the open front door. His bed was empty, the window was open, and there were footprints in the mud leading toward the chapel. Dr. Whitfield's stomach clenched with dread. "What kind of footprints?" "That's the thing that's got me spooked," Thomas replied, wiping sweat from his brow despite the morning chill. "They're Timothy's prints, all right, but they're deep. Deeper than any 8-year-old should make, like he was carrying something heavy, or like he weighed twice what he should." More screams echoed across the prairie as other families made similar discoveries. Dr. Whitfield left Thomas to care for his wife and ran from house to house confirming his worst fears. 6 of the 12 recovered children had vanished during the night: Timothy Morrison, Emma Peterson, little Mary Henderson, the Kowalski twins, and James Fletcher. All had disappeared from locked bedrooms, leaving behind only those unnaturally deep footprints leading toward the Ashford Chapel. By noon, a crowd of desperate parents had gathered at Dr. Whitfield's office, demanding answers he couldn't provide. Sarah Henderson was among them, her face etched with grief for the students she feared she'd never see again. "We have to search the chapel," declared Big Jim Peterson, Emma's uncle and the town's blacksmith. A mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks, he'd assumed leadership of the impromptu search party. "Those brothers know something about what's happened to our children. I'll come with you," Dr. Whitfield said, though every instinct screamed that they were walking into a trap. If the children are hurt, they may need medical attention. The group that set out for the Ashford Chapel consisted of 12 men, including the town's sheriff, Deputy Marshal William Hayes. Hayes was a veteran of the Indian Wars, a steady man who'd seen enough violence to remain calm in crisis situations. But even he seemed unsettled as they approached the brothers' property. The chapel stood on a slight rise at the prairie's eastern edge, surrounded by the strange black wheat that continued to grow despite the approaching winter. The building itself was an architectural anomaly, constructed from local timber and stone, yet designed in a style that seemed far older than the American frontier. Gothic arches and flying buttresses gave it the appearance of a medieval cathedral compressed into a modest country church. What immediately struck the search party as wrong was the absolute silence surrounding the structure. No birds sang in the nearby trees, no insects buzzed through the afternoon air, and even the ever-present prairie wind had stilled to nothing. The very atmosphere seemed thick and oppressive, like breathing underwater. "Look at the ground," Sheriff Hayes whispered, pointing to the earth around the chapel's perimeter. The soil was completely barren in a perfect circle extending 20 feet from the building's walls. No grass, no weeds. Not even the hardiest prairie plants could grow in that dead zone. As they approached the chapel's front entrance, Dr. Whitfield noticed other disturbing details. The wooden doors were carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when observed peripherally. The stained glass windows depicted biblical scenes, but with subtle wrongness that made the familiar stories appear blasphemous. In one window, the three wise men approaching the manger all had the faces of the Ashford brothers. "The door's unlocked," Big Jim announced, his hand on the wrought iron handle. "Should I—" "Together," Sheriff Hayes decided, drawing his service revolver, though he doubted bullets would be effective against whatever they might find inside. The chapel's interior was a study in contradictions. The pews were arranged normally, and a simple wooden altar dominated the front of the sanctuary. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colored patterns on the floor. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than a modest frontier church, but the details told a different story. The hymnals in the pews were written in that same ancient language the children had been speaking, filled with musical notations that followed no conventional scale. The wooden cross above the altar was inverted, though so subtly that it took a moment to register. And the air itself carried a sweet, cloying scent that reminded Dr. Whitfield of flowers left too long in a sick room. "There's no one here," one of the searchers called out, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "But look at this." He was pointing to the altar where fresh bloodstains marked the wooden surface. The blood was still wet, though it had a strange, oily quality that made it shimmer with rainbow colors. Beside the stains lay 6 small objects that made several of the men gasp in recognition. Personal items belonging to the missing children. Timothy's wooden toy horse, Emma's hair ribbon, the Kowalski twins' matching brass buttons. "Where are they?" Big Jim roared, his voice cracking with emotion. "What have you done with them?" "They are being prepared," came a voice from the chapel's rear. The search party spun around to find the 3 Ashford brothers standing in the doorway, blocking their exit. In the daylight streaming through the windows, their inhuman nature was impossible to deny. Their skin had the translucent quality of deep-sea creatures, with dark veins visible beneath the surface. Their eyes glowed with that inner light, and when they smiled, their teeth were revealed to be not merely sharp, but serrated like a shark's. "Prepared for what?" Sheriff Hayes demanded, though his hand shook as he aimed his revolver at Ezra's chest. "For the harvest," Ezra replied, his voice carrying that impossible harmonic quality. "For the fulfillment of the covenant made when we first arrived in your charming community." "You're talking about our children, Doctor," Whitfield said, stepping forward despite every survival instinct screaming at him to flee. "Human children with families who love them, not some crop to be harvested." Josiah and Micah exchanged those unsettling synchronized glances, their mouths curving in identical smiles. "Oh, but Doctor," Josiah said, "that's exactly what they are. Seeds that we planted, nurtured, and brought to ripeness. The fever was merely the planting season. The healing," Micah continued seamlessly, "was the cultivation, and now," Ezra concluded, "comes the harvest." The brothers began to move forward with that fluid, inhuman grace, and the temperature in the chapel dropped so rapidly that frost formed on the windows despite the afternoon warmth outside. The stained glass images began to move, the figures writhing and changing in ways that violated the laws of physics and sanity. Sheriff Hayes fired 3 shots at Ezra's chest. The bullets struck their target but simply dissolved on contact with his shimmering skin, leaving behind nothing but small wisps of smoke. "Your weapons cannot harm us," Ezra said calmly. "We are no longer bound by the limitations of flesh. We have transcended mortality through sacrifice and devotion to forces far older than your civilization." "The children," Dr. Whitfield pressed, backing toward the altar with the rest of the search party. "Are they still alive?" "Alive?" Micah tilted his head at an impossible angle, like a bird examining an interesting insect. "Such a limited concept. They have moved beyond mere existence into something far more meaningful. They are becoming," Josiah added, his voice layering with his twins in ways that created nauseating harmonics. "Transforming into instruments of the great work that we began long before your frontier town existed." As if summoned by his words, Voices began to echo from somewhere beneath the chapel floor. Children's voices, singing in that ancient language, but changed, distorted, as if coming from throats that were no longer entirely human. The basement, Sheriff Hayes realized. There's something under this building, indeed. Ezra confirmed, gesturing to a section of the floor that began to iris open like a living eye. Would you like to see what your children have become? To witness the beauty of their transformation? The hole in the floor revealed stone steps descending into absolute darkness. The children's voices grew louder, their harmonic songs now accompanied by sounds that no human throat could produce, clicks and whistles and resonant tones that seemed to vibrate through bone and marrow. "Don't go down there," Sarah whispered from the chapel's entrance where she had followed the search party against all advice. "Please, whatever you do, don't go down there." But Big Jim was already moving toward the opening, driven by desperate love for his missing niece. "Emma," he called into the darkness. "Emma, are you down there?" A voice answered, sweet and familiar, yet wrong in ways that made everyone present recoil. "Uncle Jim, is that you? Come see what I've learned. Come see how beautiful I've become." It was Emma's voice, but it came from multiple throats speaking in perfect unison. And underneath the words was something else, a wet, sliding sound like serpents moving through mud. Dr. Whitfield grabbed Big Jim's arm. "That's not her anymore. Whatever's down there, it's not your niece." But the damage was done. The search party had found the missing children, or what they had become. And as the Ashford brothers began to close the circle around them, Dr. Whitfield realized that they had walked into a trap that had been decades in the making. The harvest was about to begin, and they were all going to become part of it. The stone steps beneath the Ashford chapel descended farther than should have been possible, boring deep into the Nebraska prairie like a throat leading to the earth's intestines. Dr. Marcus Whitfield found himself pressed forward by the desperate parents behind him, each man driven by the impossible hope of rescuing their transformed children. Big Jim Peterson led the way, his blacksmith's torch casting flickering shadows on walls that were not built from any local stone. The surface was smooth and black, covered with carved symbols that seemed to writhe in the dancing light. The air grew thicker with each step downward, filled with a sweet corruption that coated the back of their throats like honey mixed with rot. "How deep does this go?" whispered Thomas Morrison, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. The acoustics were wrong. Sound seemed to linger too long and return from impossible directions. Sheriff Hayes counted steps as they descended. 57, 58, 59. The numbers climbed past any reasonable depth for a basement, past anything that should exist beneath a simple prairie chapel. The children's voices grew stronger as they descended, their harmonic songs now clearly coming from multiple directions. But there was something else mixed with the familiar voices. Adult tones, older and deeper, speaking in languages that predated human civilization. The Ashford brothers' voices yet multiplied and layered as if dozens of them sang in perfect, impossible unison. "Look at this," Dr. Whitfield called softly, pressing against the wall where a section of carving seemed different from the rest. Under the torchlight, he could make out what appeared to be a historical record carved in stone. Scenes depicting the brothers' arrival in various locations throughout history. The first panel showed 3 figures arriving at what appeared to be a medieval village, their appearance unchanged despite the centuries-old setting. The second depicted them among Native American tribes, standing over ritual fires while transformed figures danced around them. Panel after panel revealed the same pattern. The brothers arriving, a plague or disaster striking, miraculous healings, followed by transformations and disappearances. "My God," Sheriff Hayes breathed, studying the carvings. "How long have they been doing this, these pictures? Some of them look ancient." "We are old beyond your comprehension." Ezra's voice drifted down from above, though the brothers had remained in the chapel when the search party descended. "We have walked among humanity since your species first learned to speak our names. We are gardeners, and you are our crop." The stairs finally ended at a vast underground chamber that defied every law of physics and geology. The space was impossibly large, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into darkness above. Phosphorescent fungi covered the walls, providing a sickly green illumination that revealed the full horror of what the missing children had become. They stood in perfect formation at the chamber's center. 6 small figures that retained only the basic shape of the children they had been. Their skin had become translucent, revealing circulatory systems that pulsed with luminescent fluid instead of blood. Their limbs had elongated, and their fingers ended in delicate tendrils that moved independently. Most horrifying were their faces, which had maintained their human features but acquired an alien perfection that hurt to look at directly. "Papa." Timothy Morrison's voice was layered with harmonics impossible for human vocal cords. His green eyes, now large and faceted like an insect's, fixed on his father with an expression of terrible love. "We've been waiting for you. We've learned such beautiful songs." "What have they done to you?" Thomas Morrison took a step toward his transformed son, tears streaming down his face. "They've freed us," Emma Peterson answered for all of them, her child's voice now accompanied by clicking sounds and resonant tones that seemed to come from deep within her changed body. "Freed us from the limitation of singular existence. We are becoming part of something magnificent." Dr. Whitfield forced himself to observe with clinical detachment, documenting the changes even as his sanity strained to process them. The children's transformations were systematic and purposeful, not random mutations. They had been changed into something specific, designed for a purpose he was only beginning to understand. The chamber itself was circular, with 12 alcoves carved into the walls. 6 were occupied by cocoon-like structures that pulsed with the same luminescent fluid flowing through the children's veins. The remaining 6 alcoves stood empty, waiting. "You see," came Josiah's voice from the shadows, though he was nowhere to be seen. "We require 12 for the ritual. 12 seeds to plant, 12 fruits to harvest, 12 vessels to contain what we summon." The transformed children began to move in that synchronized way, arranging themselves in a complex pattern around a raised dais at the chamber's center. The dais was carved from the same black stone as the walls, but its surface was covered with symbols that seemed to move and shift even when observed directly. "The remaining 6 must be chosen," Micah's voice echoed from another direction. "Adults this time. For the final phase requires the wisdom of maturity combined with the malleability we have cultivated in the young." Big Jim raised his torch higher, trying to pierce the darkness that seemed to press against the light like a living thing. "You're not taking anyone else. We're getting our children back and ending this nightmare." A sound like laughter rippled through the chamber, but it came from too many throats and lasted far too long. "Your children are already gone," the unified voice of the Ashford brothers replied. "What remains are better versions, perfected, eternal, free from the decay of mortality." "They're abominations," Sheriff Hayes declared, though his voice shook with horror at what he was witnessing. "They are beautiful," Emma corrected, her head tilting at an angle that would have broken a human neck. "We can see colors that don't have names, hear music in the spaces between heartbeats. We understand things that your limited minds could never comprehend." Dr. Whitfield stepped closer to examine one of the empty cocoons, his medical training overriding his fear. The structure was organic, made from some fibrous material that reminded him of spider silk, but was far stronger and more complex. It pulsed with a rhythm that matched human heartbeats, as if it were alive and waiting. "The transformation process," he said aloud, more to himself than to the others. "You infected them with the fever to prepare their bodies, then used the healing ritual to begin the change. The cocoons are where the final metamorphosis occurs." "Very good, Doctor." Ezra's voice came from directly behind him, though when he spun around, nothing was there. "Your medical knowledge allows you to understand what others cannot. Would you like to experience it firsthand?" The chamber began to change around them. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like the inside of some massive lung. The phosphorescent fungi brightened, casting their sickly light in patterns that hurt to follow. And from the darkness above, shapes began to descend, not the Ashford brothers, but things that might have been them once before they had undergone their own transformation centuries ago. The creatures that dropped from the ceiling were tall and impossibly thin, their limbs elongated to spider-like proportions. Their faces retained human features but stretched and distorted, with eyes that were too large and mouths filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. They moved with fluid grace, their bodies bending and flowing in ways that defied anatomy. "Behold what we have become," the creatures spoke in unison, their voices layering into that familiar harmonic impossibility. "We were once like you, limited, mortal, bound by flesh. But we chose transcendence over death, evolution over stagnation. The search party huddled together as the transformed Ashford brothers circled them like predators. Their children, or what their children had become, watched with expressions of terrible love and anticipation. The choice is simple, the creatures continued. Join willingly and retain some measure of your consciousness through the transformation. Resist and we will take what we need by force, leaving you as empty shells to serve our purposes. There's a third option, Sheriff Hayes said grimly, pulling a stick of dynamite from his coat. I came prepared for the possibility that we might not all be leaving this place. The transformed brothers hissed in unison, a sound like steam escaping from boiling kettles. Destruction of this place would not stop what has already begun. We have seeds planted in dozens of communities across your growing nation. The transformation will continue with or without this particular harvest. Dr. Whitfield's mind raced as he tried to process the implications. You're not just targeting Millfield. This is happening everywhere. Everywhere we are needed, the creatures confirmed. Your species stands at a crossroads, Doctor. You can evolve into something greater, or you can face extinction as your world changes around you. We offer guidance, purpose, transcendence. You offer slavery, Thomas Morrison shouted, his voice cracking with grief and rage. You've stolen our children and turned them into monsters. We've given them immortality, Timothy's transformed voice replied. We've freed them from disease, from aging, from the 1,000 small deaths that flesh endures. We've made them beautiful. The children began to sing again, their voices creating harmonies that seemed to resonate through the stone floor and into the bones of everyone present. The sound was hauntingly lovely, yet filled with an alien quality that made human ears ache to hear it. As they sang, the empty cocoons began to open like flowers blooming in reverse, revealing their hollow interiors lined with the same luminescent threads. The chambers were sized for adult bodies, waiting for the search party to take their places. The ritual begins at midnight, the transformed brothers announced. You have until then to decide, willing transformation or forcible conversion. Either way, you will join the harvest. Big Jim looked at his transformed niece, his face etched with anguish. Emma, sweetheart, I know you're still in there somewhere. Please help us. Help us get you home. Emma's faceted eyes focused on him with terrible clarity. I am home, Uncle Jim. This is where I belong now, where we all belong. The old world is ending, and we are the beginning of the new one. The singing grew louder, more complex, as if dozens of voices were joining the 6 transformed children. Dr. Whitfield realized with growing horror that the sounds were coming from the occupied cocoons, that previous victims were somehow still conscious within those fibrous prisons, their voices adding to the impossible chorus. Sheriff Hayes looked at his dynamite, then at the children who were no longer children. How long do we have? He asked. Dr. Whitfield checked his pocket watch with trembling hands. 3 hours until midnight. Then we have 3 hours to find a way out of this hell, the sheriff declared. And if we can't save the children, we'll make sure these things can't hurt anyone else. But as the transformed Ashford brothers began to laugh with voices like breaking glass, Dr. Whitfield suspected that escape was never part of their plan. They were meant to witness this horror, to understand the futility of resistance, to choose transformation over death. The harvest was entering its final phase, and they were all going to be part of it whether they wanted to be or not. The telegram that reached the Office of Unusual Phenomena in Washington, D.C. on October 16, 1878, was brief, but alarming enough to mobilize resources that officially didn't exist. Entire search party missing Millfield, Nebraska. Stop 12 children transformed. Stop Ashford brothers. Not human, stop, send help before midnight. Stop Whitfield. Agent Harrison Clark read the message twice before reaching for his secure telephone, one of only a dozen such devices connected to the federal government's most classified department. The Office of Unusual Phenomena had been created in the aftermath of the Civil War, when battlefield reports of impossible occurrences had forced the government to acknowledge that the world contained threats beyond conventional military understanding. Sir, we have a Code 7 situation in Nebraska, Clark reported to his superior, Director Nathaniel Cross. The Ashford file is active again. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The Ashford brothers had been on federal watch lists for over 2 decades. Their pattern of arrival, epidemic, healing, and disappearance tracked across 7 states. But they had never been caught in the act, never definitively linked to the mysterious vanishings that followed their ministry work. "Mobilize Team Alpha," Director Cross ordered. "Full containment protocol, and Clark, take the special ammunition." 6 hours later, a specially modified train pulled into the Millfield Prairie Depot, carrying 12 federal agents equipped with weapons and knowledge that would have been deemed impossible by the general public. Agent Clark led the team, accompanied by Dr. Elizabeth Marsh, the government's leading expert on supernatural biology, and Father Michael Romano, a Jesuit priest whose understanding of ancient languages had proven invaluable in previous cases. The town they found was eerily quiet, with most residents barricaded in their homes. The few people brave enough to venture outside spoke in whispers about the sounds that had been coming from the Ashford Chapel all night. Singing voices, inhuman howls, and rhythmic pounding that seemed to shake the very ground. The local sheriff was part of the search party that went missing, reported Agent Thompson, Clark's second-in-command. "We have no official law enforcement presence, and the townspeople are too terrified to organize any kind of resistance." Clark consulted the thick file he carried, filled with decades of reports on the Ashford brothers. "According to our intelligence, they require 12 subjects for their final ritual. If they have the search party plus the 6 children, that gives them exactly what they need." Dr. Marsh was examining soil samples near the chapel through a specially designed microscope. "The ground contamination extends in a perfect circle around the structure," she observed. "Whatever's happening here is affecting the very molecular structure of the earth. This level of supernatural influence suggests they're preparing for something catastrophic." Father Romano knelt and touched the blackened earth, his lips moving in silent prayer. "The consecrated ground has been inverted," he announced grimly. "This entire area has been transformed into a conduit for forces that should not exist in our reality." As they approached the chapel, the federal team could hear the impossible harmonies that Dr. Whitfield had described in his telegram. But now the voices were stronger, more numerous, creating sonic patterns that seemed to vibrate through their bones and into their souls. "Blessed silver rounds," Agent Clark reminded his team, checking his specially modified revolver. "Aim for center mass, but remember, these things may not have vital organs in the locations you'd expect." The chapel doors stood open, revealing an interior that had been transformed since the search party's entry. The pews had been arranged in concentric circles around a hole in the floor that pulsed with sickly light. The stained glass windows now showed scenes that definitely weren't biblical, twisted figures engaged in rituals that hurt to observe directly. The basement, Dr. Marsh identified, studying readings from her instruments. Massive energy displacement coming from directly below. Whatever they're doing down there is building toward a crescendo. Agent Clark made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "We're going down." The stone steps were slick with moisture that gleamed like oil in their electric torchlight. The symbols carved into the walls seemed to writhe and shift, and Father Romano muttered prayers in Latin as they descended into the impossible depth of the chamber below. What they found defied every briefing they had received, every case study in their classified files. The underground chamber had expanded since the search party's arrival, its walls now stretching beyond the reach of their lights. 12 cocoons hung from the ceiling, all of them occupied and pulsing with luminescent life. But it wasn't the cocoons that stopped the federal agents in their tracks. It was what stood at the chamber's center. The Ashford brothers had completed their own transformation, revealing their true nature as something that had never been human. They towered nearly 10 feet tall, their bodies composed of the same translucent material as the cocoons, filled with flowing patterns of light and shadow. Their faces retained recognizable features but stretched and multiplied across their elongated skulls. They had dozens of eyes, arranged in complex patterns that tracked movement with predatory intelligence. Around them, the 12 transformed subjects stood in perfect formation. 6 children and 6 adults, all changed into something between human and something else entirely. Dr. Whitfield was among them, his medical training evident in how systematically he had been altered. His body showed the same translucent skin and elongated limbs, but his transformation had been guided to retain his analytical mind, creating a hybrid of human intelligence and alien biology. "Federal agents," the transformed Dr. Whitfield observed, his voice carrying the same harmonic impossibility as the others. We were wondering when you would arrive. Your government has been tracking us for decades, hasn't it? Agent Clark raised his weapon, though he wasn't sure conventional ammunition would be effective against creatures that seemed to exist partially outside normal physics. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, by the authority of the United States government, I'm ordering you to release the hostages and surrender for questioning. A sound like laughter rippled through the chamber, coming from all 12 transformed subjects simultaneously. Hostages? The unified voice replied. We are willing participants in the greatest evolutionary leap your species has ever experienced. We have been chosen to bridge the gap between what humanity is and what it must become. Dr. Marsh was frantically taking readings with her instruments, trying to understand the energy patterns that filled the chamber. The transformation process is still active, she reported urgently. They're not finished yet. This is just the preparation phase. Father Romano stepped forward, clutching a silver crucifix that began to glow with warm light as it neared the transformed beings. In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to release these souls from your corruption. The response was immediate and violent. The transformed Ashford brothers let out a shriek that shattered several of Agent Clark's instruments and sent Father Romano to his knees, blood streaming from his ears. The chamber walls began to pulse faster, and the cocoons swayed as if moved by invisible currents. Your primitive superstitions have no power here, the lead Ashford entity declared. This place exists outside your reality now, connected to forces that were ancient when your civilizations were still dreaming in caves. Agent Thompson opened fire with blessed silver rounds, his shots striking the nearest transformed brother center mass. The bullets passed through the creature's translucent body, leaving behind brief trails of silver light that seemed to cause it pain, but no lasting damage. Physical weapons are insufficient, the transformed Dr. Whitfield observed clinically. We exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Your bullets affect only the portion of us that remains anchored in your limited reality. Clark realized with growing horror that they had walked into an impossible situation. His team was equipped to handle supernatural threats, but these entities existed on a level that their weapons and training couldn't touch. What do you want? He demanded, lowering his weapon. Completion, all 12 transformed beings replied in unison. We have gathered the necessary subjects, prepared the ritual space, and opened the channels between dimensions. At midnight, we will summon those who sent us, and your world will begin its transformation into something greater. Doctor. Marsh checked her pocket watch with trembling hands. 11:40 p.m., we have 20 minutes. 20 minutes until what? Agent Clark asked, though he suspected he didn't want to know the answer. Until the great old ones return, Father Romano whispered, his face pale with theological terror. Until humanity's childhood ends and our true education begins. The singing grew louder, more complex, as if thousands of voices were joining the chamber's chorus, and high above, something vast and impossible began to press against the barriers between worlds, eager to reclaim a planet it had ruled long before humans evolved. The federal government's most secret team had arrived too late to prevent the ritual. All they could do now was witness the end of the world as they knew it and decide whether to fight the inevitable or join the transformation that was about to consume everything they had sworn to protect. At 11:58 p.m. on October 16, 1878, reality began to unravel in the chamber beneath Millfield Prairie. Agent Harrison Clark watched helplessly as the 12 cocoons pulsed in perfect synchronization, their occupants adding their voices to a chorus that seemed to resonate through dimensions beyond human comprehension. The transformed Ashford brothers stood at the chamber's center, their elongated forms beginning to blur and shift, as if they were becoming something even less human than before. The convergence begins, the unified voices announced, their words layered with harmonics that made the stone walls vibrate. Those who sent us have been waiting so very long to reclaim what was always theirs. Above them, the chapel floor began to iris open like a vast eye, revealing the night sky above Millfield. But the stars weren't right. Constellations had shifted into patterns that hurt to observe, and between them, darker shapes moved with purpose and intelligence. Doctor. Elizabeth Marsh's instruments screamed warnings as energy levels spiked beyond their measurement capabilities. The dimensional barriers are collapsing, she reported, her voice strained with terror and scientific fascination. Something is coming through, something massive. Father Romano struggled to his feet, his crucifix now blazing with silver fire that seemed to provide the only stable light in the increasingly fluid reality around them. "The apocalypse," he whispered. Not as the Bible describes, but as it truly is, the revelation of what humanity was never meant to know. The transformed Dr. Whitfield turned his faceted eyes toward the federal agents, his expression mixing human concern with alien detachment. "You should leave," he advised. "What comes next will be difficult for unchanged minds to process. We are about to witness the return of gods." "We're not leaving anyone behind," Agent Clark declared, though his voice shook with the knowledge that they were facing forces beyond any human authority. "Then observe," the 12 transformed beings replied in unison. "Witness the birth of a new age." The chamber walls began to expand impossibly, stretching outward until they encompassed not just the space beneath the chapel, but what felt like the entire world. Reality became fluid, with the transformed beings serving as anchor points in an ocean of shifting possibility. Through the opening above, something descended. It was not one entity but many. A collective consciousness that had been divided across dimensions for eons, finally reuniting in the space the Ashford brothers had prepared. The beings were impossible to describe in human language. They existed as geometric forms that folded through dimensions, as living mathematics, as pure thought given substance. They were beautiful and terrible, ancient beyond measure, and utterly indifferent to human concepts of morality or meaning. "We have maintained the covenant," the Ashford entities reported to their masters. "The seeds have been planted, the harvest gathered, the ritual completed. This world is ready for transformation." The descending presences communicated without words, their thoughts rippling through the chamber in waves of color and sensation. Agent Clark felt his mind struggling to process concepts that had no human equivalent, understanding flooding through him that was both enlightening and devastating. These entities had ruled Earth long before humanity existed, when the planet was young and the laws of physics were more flexible. They had been forced to retreat when cosmic conditions changed, but they had always planned to return. The Ashford brothers were their servants, planted across time to prepare for this moment when the stars would align properly, and the barriers between worlds would weaken. "The transformation will be gradual," the transformed Dr. Whitfield explained, his scientific mind translating the alien communication for his former colleagues. "Humanity will be given the gift of evolution, the chance to become something greater than mere animals struggling in the dirt. Some will adapt willingly, others will require encouragement." Dr. Marsh watched in horrified fascination as the process began. The 12 transformed beings started to dissolve, their consciousness expanding outward to touch every human mind within a 100-mile radius. In towns and farms across Nebraska, people suddenly found their dreams filled with new knowledge. Their perceptions shifted to accommodate realities they had never imagined. "Stop this," Agent Thompson demanded, firing blessed silver rounds at the descending entities. The bullets passed through them without effect, as meaningless as raindrops against a mountain. "It cannot be stopped," Father Romano said quietly, his faith shaken by the revelation that these entities predated every human religion. "This was always going to happen. We were just insects building nests on a giant's chest, unaware that it would eventually wake up." The chamber began to ascend, carrying them upward through the earth as if the soil and rock were nothing more than water. They emerged on the surface to find Millfield Prairie transformed. The wheat field stretched to the horizon, but the grain was no longer black. It glowed with the same phosphorescent light as the cocoons, swaying in patterns that suggested intelligence. The town itself was changing. Buildings flowed like liquid, reforming into structures that followed non-Euclidean geometry. The people of Millfield stood in their doorways, no longer entirely human, but not yet fully transformed, their faces showing the same serene acceptance as the 12 who had undergone complete metamorphosis. "This is just the beginning," the entity that had once been Dr. Whitfield explained. "The changes will spread outward like ripples in a pond, touching every corner of your world. Within a generation, humanity as you know it will cease to exist." Agent Clark looked at his remaining team members, seeing the same mixture of horror and helpless fascination in their eyes. They had failed in their mission to prevent this catastrophe, but perhaps they could still serve a purpose. We have to warn the government, he decided. Document what we've seen, prepare them for what's coming. Warn them of what? Dr. Marsh asked, her scientific instruments now registering energy patterns that shouldn't exist according to human understanding of physics, that evolution is inevitable, that change is coming whether we resist or not. The transformed beings began to disperse, spreading across the prairie to begin their work of gradual conversion. The entities from beyond continued their descent, taking up residence in structures that were being reformed to accommodate their impossible geometries. You may go. The presence that had orchestrated everything communicated directly into their minds. Tell your leaders what you have witnessed. Let them prepare as they see fit. The outcome will be the same regardless. Humanity will evolve or face extinction. As dawn broke over the transformed landscape of Millfield Prairie, the federal agents found themselves alone among the wheat fields that now sang with alien voices. Their mission had failed catastrophically, but they were alive to bear witness to the beginning of humanity's transformation into something unrecognizable. Agent Clark gathered his team and began the long walk back to their train, knowing that the reports they would file would be classified so deeply that they might never see the light of day. The government would try to contain the spreading changes, to suppress the evidence, to maintain the illusion that the world remained as it had always been. But the transformation had begun, and it could not be stopped. Within months, similar incidents would be reported from across the American frontier, communities found empty except for structures that defied architectural logic and wheat fields that glowed in the dark. The reports would be buried, the witnesses discredited or silenced, the truth deemed too dangerous for public knowledge. Yet in the government's deepest archives, in files marked with classifications that officially didn't exist, the documentation would remain. Evidence of the night when humanity's childhood ended and its real education began. The macabre legacy of the three brothers would be recorded, sealed, and forgotten by all, save those tasked with monitoring humanity's gradual transformation into something the ancient gods would find worthy of their attention. And in the wheat fields of Nebraska, voices would continue to sing in languages older than human civilization, calling to those ready to embrace what they were destined to become. The harvest was complete, but it was also just the beginning.